So when we're talking about racial formation, what do we mean when you're talking about race, right? So one thing we want you guys to get out of that reading is that race is a master category. Because often what happens is we have this conflation between race and racism. And I know what was said earlier. It's helpful for us to recognize that race is a fundamental concept that has shaped and continues to shape the political, the economic, and just the culture of the United States, right? While the authors argue that race is a master category, Seth and we believe that race and gender are the fundamental categories that actually shape each of those three things as well: polity, economy, and culture. So we take it a little bit of a different approach, but we see those two as important distinction markers that white men in power used. Now, a good way to understand race, we believe, is that it's a concept that signifies and symbolizes social conflicts by referring to different types of human bodies, right? It's a making up of people, right? It's how we can to understand ourselves and others. There is a process we would call racialization, right? Which is the extension of racial meaning to a previously racially unclassified group. So historically, before the concept of a race evolved into the way it is, which happened during the colonial period, people distinguished themselves often by region or by religion, right? And so Spain, I think, is a really good example, because what we find in Spain before you have the Reconquista, so this is before, as Spain becomes more and more Catholic, or gets reoccupied, I should say, or reconquered by Catholics. Before this, it was, you have the Moors who are in that space. They're often called, Muslim Moors from North Africa. But they had been there so long, you're talking about a few hundred years, what you see is this mixing of both European and North Africans, and a mixing of religions of both Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, generally speaking, functioning together, where you have one culture and three different religions. And so, that's how people distinguish themselves, right? They were this culture, even though they're different religions. And so it's always been kind of malleable. That's the point I wanted to make, right? And then when colonialism happens, you have this need to theologically justify colonialism, to say these people they're different from us, right? So you see this take place with Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal, whether he goes to southern sub-Saharan African, and also the voyages to South America and America, where you see this kind of extension of meaning of folk, and then it gets transferred to Black folks and indigenous folks and whatever, regardless of religion. But it's important to note that the concept of race, while new, there's always been this importance of distinction between groups of people, right? There's always been this importance of distinction. And so we're talking about it within an American context. One good example is the Irish, and how the Irish, for many of you who do not know, were not viewed as white when they got here, for lots of different reasons. And so this is an example of a newspaper called the American Patriot. It was it basically is like the Tea Party of their day. And when you read this, and we're going to send it to you in email, so I'm not going to read it all, but essentially this article, this newspaper was arguing that the infestation is the kind of word they would use, Irish Catholic folk to America was disruptive to the American norm, disruptive to the American way, that they weren't really true Americans. And some of this was, again, wrapped up in anti-Catholic sentiment. Much of it was wrapped up in anti-Irish sentiment. And these people were poor because they were escaping the potato famine. And so a lot of the same arguments you hear today that's anti-immigrant, it's similar. So even though these people were what we might call today white, this is the same kind of logic that we saw in that space. What's also fascinating is, so this is a newspaper image of that. And what you see here, you see a drunken Irishman that's about to essentially blow up the country. As you see him sitting on a gunpowder. It says Uncle Sam's gunpowder. What's fascinating about this caricature is many of you probably are familiar with the fact that often Black people are portrayed using simian imagery, so animality, right, portrayed as animals. And you see this overlap here where you have this Irishman that when you look at him, you see he doesn't quite look human, right? Doesn't quite look fully human. And so this is part of the reason why, as we'll move on with this course, we talk a lot about theological anthropology from a Christian perspective. What does it mean to be fully human? And how might this kind of ranking of humanness, this hierarchy, how has this been used to weaponize what it means, and how we have these kinds of conversation?